In Dallas, on November 23, 1979, a couple was out buying cigarettes at a liquor store. While the man went inside the store, the woman stayed outside. She went to use a payphone. It was very late at night, so it would have been hard for anyone to see very far or notice anyone. She wondered what was taking her husband so long in the store. As she was making a call on the payphone, she was startled by the sight of two men staring at her with malicious intent. She was frightened, but tried to disregard it. When she went back to her car, she saw one of the men with a gun to her partner's head as they forced the couple into the car. The couple was forced to drive down the highway by the two men, with one in the front seat with a gun to the man's head, and the other in the back with a gun held to the woman. The couple had no idea where they were being taken, but they knew it was somewhere where no one would be able to see them. As the car started to stop, the assailants robbed and beat the male victim before dragging the woman out of the vehicle. The assailants robbed her of her wallet and her fur coat and took her into the woods. And they assaulted her. The victims of the assault and robbery described the assailants, and a description was released to the public. A short time after that night, two men were seen walking about 2 miles from the scene of the crime, and they fit the description made by the victims. So they were brought down to the station, and those two men were Anthony Massengill and Cornelius Dupree. These men were taken into custody, and their pictures were taken to be visually identified by the victims. Now, when we lined them up for the victims to visually identify, the male victim couldn't identify them, but the female was able to. Now, Cornelius had only even gotten involved in this case because he was seen walking about 2 miles from the scene of the crime. He had no relation to the victim whatsoever, and again, was only visually identified by the female victim before the trial. So that was the only thing that the prosecutor could argue based on. We didn't have any DNA evidence, even though we tested all the evidence that we had. The only thing that the prosecutor could argue was the visual identification of the female victim, and they hoped that that would suffice for the jury. On April 3rd, 1980, the trial was held. In court, the female victim identified both Cornelius Dupree and Anthony Massengill as the assailants. But what was different was that day, the male victim also identified both men, making his argument that his vision had previously been impaired, causing him not to be able to identify the men before. Cornelius then gave his testimony explaining the cross-racial misidentification of himself and Anthony Massengill. Of course, his testimony wasn't strong enough to beat even an eyewitness as evidence. So the judge and the jury ruled in favor of the victims and sentenced Cornelius Dupree to 75 years in prison on 1 count of rape and 1 count of aggravated robbery. After he was convicted, Cornelius filed 3 petitions for a writ of habeas corpus, which would have granted him a new trial, but he was denied each time. And he was offered a chance for parole, but he declined it because he absolutely refused to admit to a crime that he did not commit. Cornelius Dupree wrote to several organizations which have not been named, but was represented by the Innocence Project. And the project contacted the Dallas Police Department, who cooperated in the Innocence Project's reinvestigation of Dupree by allowing the use of any physical evidence that they still had, which were only hair combings of the victim. In 2009, the Innocence Project was allowed to run STR DNA tests on the hair combings, and an abundance of sperm cells were found. Forensic analysts found 2 male profiles as possible sources of the DNA, and Cornelius Dupree was not one of them. He was not even a possible source of the DNA. The district attorney's office was informed of this, and eventually Cornelius Dupree was granted habeas corpus relief, and on July 22nd, 2010, he was let out of prison on parole, and he was officially exonerated on April 11th, 2011.
What personal conclusions can you draw from this case?
Well, looking at the first trial of the case, it really seems like the only reason Dupree was convicted was based on faulty eyewitness testimony, because that was virtually the prosecutor's only argument. And eyewitness testimony is in no case enough to convict someone, because there are far too many cases in which the witness are either wrong or they simply lie. So I believe that if investigators relied less on eyewitness testimonies and more on hard evidence, there would be far less occurrences like this where a person is convicted of a crime that they did not commit.
Do you think DNA is always reliable to use in court?
I think that if the tests are run correctly and have reliable machines, tools, and analysts, then yeah, DNA is reliable to use in court. But there have been a lot of cases where someone forgot to clean a tool or an analyst ran a test wrong, and that led to taking years of life away from an innocent person. So, hold on.
Do you think DNA is always reliable to use in court?
I think that if the tests are run correctly and using reliable machines, tools, and analysts, then yeah, DNA is reliable to use in court. But there's been a lot of cases, including this one, where someone either forgot to clean a tool or an analyst ran a test wrong, and that led to taking years of life away from an innocent person. And in this case, the whole case was based on eyewitness protection, so DNA wasn't even involved in the case. So, I mean, DNA can be probably one of the best sources of evidence to convict someone if the procedures used to test it are reliable. But if they aren't, then they're just subject to faultiness as eyewitnesses are.